Good evening, dear listener. Today is August 30th, 2025, here in New York. The air is starting to cool as summer slips away. But for many American families, the weight of everyday life feels heavier than ever. The cost of living continues to rise. Groceries are almost 10% more expensive than they were just 2 years ago. Rents in many cities keep climbing, while wages move upward only in small steps. Debts pile up in the form of credit cards, student loans, and mortgages, and they seem to grow faster than anyone can pay them down. The job market, once a source of pride, has begun to show cracks. Unemployment has pushed above 4%, and people's confidence in the future has fallen to the lowest level in over a year. For countless households, this is no longer about distant politics or abstract numbers. It is the moment when a stack of bills lands on the kitchen table, and the paycheck does not stretch far enough to cover them. It is the uneasy thought that tomorrow may cost more than today. As difficult as this feels, history reminds us that others have faced this burden before. Centuries ago, across Europe, kings and queens who looked untouchable in their power discovered that they too could be broken by debt. Behind the glitter of their palaces and the pageantry of their courts, treasuries were drained by war after war. Monarchs borrowed to raise armies, borrowed again to build fleets, and borrowed still more to defend their borders. They believed that victories would pay the bills, but victories faded quickly, and creditors never forgot. Spain was once overflowing with silver from the New World, yet it declared bankruptcy many times until its strength withered away. France, weighed down by the costs of foreign wars, struggled to calm the anger of its own people, and eventually the monarchy collapsed in revolution. Even Britain, which stood triumphant over Napoleon, carried debts so vast that they haunted the empire for generations. In the end, thrones did not always fall in battle. More often they fell because the numbers in the ledgers no longer added up, because creditors refused to wait, and because ordinary people crushed by taxes could no longer endure the burden. This leaves us with a question that reaches across time. If crowns and empires could not survive the weight of debt, how can ordinary families today hope to carry it on their own shoulders? To find an answer, we must walk back into the past and listen to what it has to say. The story you are about to hear is not only about kings and kingdoms that have vanished, it is also about the quiet and timeless force of debt itself. How it humbled the mighty, reshaped nations, and still lingers in our lives today. So let us begin. Take a moment to relax, let the noise of the day fade away, and allow history to speak softly around you. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, do not forget to subscribe. That simple gesture ensures you will not miss the next tale, and it gives us the encouragement to keep bringing these forgotten lessons of the past into the present. Lessons that may carry warnings, but also a measure of hope. Spain's reputation as the richest empire in the 16th century is one of the great paradoxes of history. Because for all the silver that crossed the Atlantic, the kingdom could not escape the grip of bankruptcy. King Philip II declared insolvency 3 times during his reign, in 1557, 1575, and again in 1596, and each announcement sent tremors through the financial capitals of Europe. Genoese and Augsburg bankers who had trusted the crown suddenly faced ruin. Investors pulled away, and confidence in Spain's power cracked. What startled observers most was that this downfall was happening at the very moment when silver from the Americas seemed to pour in without end. The empire that was supposed to be unshakably rich was in fact living on credit and running out of time. To understand this contradiction, one must look closely at the flow of money itself. Ships left the mines of Potosi, in what we now call Bolivia, and Zacatecas, in what is today Mexico, with holds full of bullion. In Seville, merchants and nobles gathered to watch their arrival, believing they were witnessing the proof of Spain's greatness. Yet the truth was less glorious. Most of the silver had already been promised before it even left American shores. Contracts had been signed with bankers in Genoa, Antwerp, and Augsburg, securing loans that kept Spain's armies in the field. By the time the galleons docked, much of the treasure was no longer Spain's to keep. The monarchy had become little more than a courier, ferrying wealth across the ocean only to hand it over to creditors waiting impatiently in Europe. The cause of this dependency was war. Philip inherited commitments from his father, Charles V, who had waged costly campaigns to defend the Habsburg Empire, stretching from Iberia to Central Europe. Philip continued the pattern, fighting in Italy, enforcing his authority in the Netherlands, and battling the Ottoman fleet in the Mediterranean. Wars are expensive in every age, and 16th-century campaigns devoured resources at a staggering pace. Soldiers required wages, artillery needed metal, and fortresses demanded constant repair. Each time the treasury ran low, new loans were secured against the promise of the next shipment of silver. It was the same cycle a modern family might experience when paychecks arrive, already claimed by debts, forcing them to borrow again simply to keep going. The result of this endless borrowing was a fragile financial system that collapsed whenever creditors lost faith. When Philip announced the bankruptcy of 1557, it was not because Spain lacked wealth in the abstract. It was because the flow of treasure was already pledged, and no money was available to meet immediate obligations. The shock was immense. European financiers realized that even the mightiest empire could fail to pay its bills. The parallel for today's Americans is striking. A household may appear stable from the outside, with steady income and visible assets. But if every dollar is already promised to lenders, a single unexpected bill can send the family into crisis. In Spain's case, the unexpected bill was simply the cost of wars that lasted longer and consumed more than anticipated. For ordinary Spaniards, the situation was grim. They saw the spectacle of ships unloading silver, yet they did not feel richer. Instead, they faced higher taxes as the crown sought to squeeze every coin from its people. Records from Castile tell of peasants burdened by levies on essentials like salt and bread, while artisans found their earnings eaten away by fees. At the same time, the value of money declined because the constant influx of silver drove inflation. Historians later called this the price revolution, a long wave of rising prices that eroded purchasing power. Bread, wool, and wine cost more each year, while wages lagged far behind. Too many Spaniards, empire meant not prosperity, but hardship, a cruel irony for a people living at the center of global conquest. This pattern of great wealth masking deeper weakness resonates today. Americans know what it is like to watch headlines announce economic growth while their own paychecks do not stretch far enough. They know what it is like to see wealth concentrated at the top, while ordinary families struggle with debts that grow faster than their wages. The story of Spain in the 16th century is not remote or irrelevant. It is a mirror held up to the present, reminding us that living on borrowed promises can make even the richest appear hollow. The warning is as clear now as it was then. Spain's treasure ships dazzled Europe, but their cargoes were already spoken for. The empire's victories brought momentary pride, but each celebration was followed by another bill that could not be paid. Behind the glittering facade of power, the foundations were eroding. For modern America, with its own mountains of debt and families balancing on the edge of insolvency, the story of Spain offers a sobering lesson. Wealth without balance and credit without restraint do not secure the future. They hasten the fall. The Spanish bankruptcies of the 16th century were not just moments of embarrassment in royal courts. They were turning points that shaped the daily lives of ordinary men and women. After King Philip II's announcement, in 1557, that the crown could no longer meet its obligations, the consequences were felt far beyond the bankers in Genoa and Augsburg. The kingdom had to find ways to keep its armies in the field, and its government running. That meant turning to its own people, who bore the weight through heavier taxes, shrinking wages, and the slow realization that the empire's victories brought them no reward. Records from Castile, the heartland of Spain, describe an almost relentless pressure on the countryside. Farmers who had once hoped to prosper from the empire's wealth now found themselves handing over more of their harvests each year. Grain was collected not just to feed soldiers, but also to be sold, so that the crown could raise cash to cover interest payments. In towns, craftsmen faced a similar burden. The sale of cloth, wine, and other goods was taxed repeatedly, so that even the most diligent work did little to improve family fortunes. Inflation magnified the pain. With so much silver entering Europe, the value of money declined. Historians estimate that in the course of a single generation, prices for essentials nearly doubled, while wages rose only slowly. For a laborer, this meant working the same hours but buying less bread, less meat, and fewer clothes for his family. The irony was bitter. Spain was the center of a global empire, its ships crossing the Atlantic and Pacific, its soldiers feared. Across Europe, its court dazzling with displays of grandeur. Yet within its borders, families were stretched thin. Hunger was not uncommon, even in fertile regions, and peasants sometimes abandoned their land when the combination of taxes and rising prices left them with nothing. Complaints recorded in local councils tell of resentment toward officials, who seemed more interested in collecting coin than protecting the welfare of the people. In cities, unrest simmered whenever new levies were introduced, as residents who lived hand-to-mouth could not see how they would survive another demand for payment. The soldiers who fought in Spain's wars did not escape the crisis either. Letters from the period describe men waiting months to be paid. When wages finally arrived, they often discovered that the silver coins in their purses had lost value in the time they were owed. Some deserted, others turned to looting, and the crown's armies suffered as morale broke down. A kingdom that should have drawn strength from its people and its armies was instead draining both. Looking back, it is striking how familiar this feels in today's world. Many American families know the frustration of working harder, yet seeing their pay cover less. They see grocery bills rise while their income lags behind. They shoulder the costs of healthcare, housing, and education, much like the Spaniards bore taxes on bread, wine, and salt. Just as Spain's peasants and artisans realized that empire did not shield them from hardship, modern citizens realize that national power does not always translate into security at home. Spain's decline reminds us that the weight of debt is never abstract. It lands squarely on households, on parents trying to feed their children, on workers trying to save a little for the future, on soldiers promised pay that never matches the risk of their service. The empire's grandeur could not disguise the reality that its foundation was cracking, and in those cracks grew anger, fatigue, and the quiet erosion of loyalty to the crown. The story of Spain's people during this period is not only a warning from the past, but a mirror held up to the present. It shows that when leaders depend on debt to sustain their power, it is always the ordinary citizen who pays first and pays most. And in that payment lies the beginning of decline. For a nation cannot remain strong when its people grow weaker by the day. By the late 16th century, Spain had become less a master of its wealth than a servant to those who financed it. The empire's most powerful allies were not always its soldiers or admirals, but the bankers of Genoa, Antwerp, and later Amsterdam. These financiers controlled the flow of credit that kept Spain's armies in the field and its ships at sea. Without them, the empire could not function. It was an extraordinary shift in power. Kings who claimed divine right to rule found themselves dependent on men with ledgers and pens, men who demanded interest before they would release another shipment of coin. The arrangement grew increasingly lopsided. Bankers saw the risks clearly. They knew that Spain's spending outpaced its income, and that the silver shipments from the New World, while vast, were not limitless. They raised interest rates, insisted on direct rights to collect certain taxes, and demanded monopolies over trade routes or goods. Gradually, they secured control over customs, houses, and tolls, ensuring that their payments arrived, regardless of whether the crown was solvent. In practice, the Spanish monarchy had mortgaged parts of its own sovereignty. Each time the king signed another contract, more of the empire's future was already spent. The consequences for Spain's wars were immediate. When bankers refused new loans, campaigns stalled. Soldiers went unpaid, morale collapsed, and desertions increased. Victories that might have been possible never materialized because the funds to sustain them simply did not exist. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 against the Ottoman fleet was celebrated as a triumph. But even that success could not mask the growing fragility of the Spanish system. For every moment of glory, there were months of negotiation with creditors, haggling over interest rates and begging for extensions. Military strategy was no longer decided entirely in royal councils. It was shaped in boardrooms where financiers held more sway than generals. Ordinary Spaniards felt this shift as well. Each new loan, extracted by bankers, meant heavier taxation at home. Families who already struggled with rising prices now saw collectors at their doors more often. They paid tolls on the roads, fees at the markets, and levies on their land, knowing much of it would never stay in Spain but would travel north to satisfy creditors. Letters from the era speak of resentment toward foreign influence, of a sense that the kingdom was no longer its own master. The pride of empire was fading into the bitterness of servitude. The parallel to today's America is difficult to ignore. Families often live under the terms of lenders who decide the conditions of mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. A paycheck arrives, but much of it is directed to creditors before it ever reaches the household budget. The sense of freedom that comes with income is dulled by obligations that shape every decision. In Spain's case, the empire continued to expand on maps, but the decisions that mattered were made elsewhere, in counting houses beyond its borders. In America's case, households may look comfortable from the outside, yet the choices about how to live, where to live, and what future to plan are already influenced by debts that narrow possibilities. The lesson of Spain's dependency is stark. Power built on borrowed money is never secure, because the true authority rests with the lender, not the borrower. For Spain, this reality became undeniable as the 16th century closed. The king wore a crown, the armies carried banners, and the ships flew flags. But the empire's fate was written not in declarations of divine right, but in contracts signed with financiers. The throne looked unshakable, yet its strength was hollow. The empire was brilliant on the surface, but fragile within. A warning that even the greatest powers lose control when their wealth is no longer their own. By the early 17th century, Spain's weakness could no longer be hidden. The bankruptcy of 1596 had already damaged confidence, so severely that even loyal creditors hesitated to lend more. The once mighty Armada, destroyed by storms and English fire in 1588, remained a ghost that haunted the empire. Spain still carried the name of a great power, but its strength was eroding in ways that everyone could see. Campaigns that once promised glory now ended in compromises, shaped less by strategy than by a treasury that had nothing left to give. Every part of Spanish life reflected this slow decline. The great fleets that had once crossed oceans in convoys now sailed in smaller groups, vulnerable to Dutch and English privateers. Ports that had once thrived grew quieter as merchants sought safer routes under rival flags. Inland, towns that had once bustled with artisans lost their vitality as skilled workers left for opportunities elsewhere in Europe. Farmers who had cultivated the same fields for generations abandoned their land when taxes consumed more than they could produce. Even the church, which towered above Spanish society, could not shield families from hunger. Its cathedrals remained magnificent, but outside their doors, the poor waited in long lines for alms. A living contrast between grandeur and despair. Spain's rivals seized the moment. The Dutch Republic, once a rebellious province, became a leader in trade and finance. English ships claimed victories at sea and began to spread influence across the Atlantic. France looked for openings along its borders. Spain, which had once dictated terms to others, now faced a world where others dictated terms to it. The empire still stretched across continents, but its grip on that vast territory was loosening, and every rival could sense it. The monarchy tried to maintain appearances. Ceremonies at court continued, and parades were staged to celebrate even small victories. Yet behind the gilded walls of Madrid, the truth was well known. Silver shipments had slowed, bankers were cautious, and tax revenues no longer kept pace. With expenses, what had once dazzled Europe was slipping away, leaving only obligations that chained the empire to decline. The pattern should sound familiar to Americans today. A country may look prosperous on the surface, its cities busy and its markets active, yet beneath the surface families can feel exhaustion. Shiny symbols of wealth, skyscrapers, stock indexes, government statistics scan hide the reality that households are struggling. Like Spain, modern America shows strength abroad, while many of its citizens quietly wrestle with debt at home. The outward appearance of power is not always the same as inner stability. Spain's 17th century decline was not a sudden fall, but a steady erosion. Confidence drained away bit by bit, until even victories could not disguise the weakness. For the Spanish people, it meant a life of sacrifice without progress. For the crown, it meant a throne that looked secure but was fragile at its core. And for us, looking back from the present, it is a reminder that greatness without balance cannot endure. The final stage of Spain's silver empire was not a spectacular collapse, but a long surrender to exhaustion. By the middle of the 17th century, the empire was no longer feared as it once had been. The endless shipments of treasure from the Americas had slowed. Wars yielded fewer rewards, and the bankers of Europe had grown cautious. Spain still held vast territories, but its victories were rare, its losses costly, and its debts never-ending. The richest crown of the 16th century had discovered by the 17th that its reputation was brighter than its reality. For the people who lived under that crown, the decline meant a life of giving more and receiving less. Families continued to pay high taxes while watching their standard of living erode. A farmer in Castile might surrender much of his harvest, only to struggle feeding his own children. A craftsman in Seville might see his trade taxed until his profit vanished. Soldiers, once proud to march under Spain's banner, went unpaid or were rewarded with coins worth less than when they were promised. The dream of empire that had filled the air with triumph turned into a routine of sacrifice without reward. Even the image of Spain's glory became a hollow mask. Ceremonies continued at court, dignitaries bowed before the king, and chronicles praised the empire's might. But ordinary citizens knew the truth, and so did Spain's rivals. The Dutch Republic, England and France rose higher with each passing decade, while Spain struggled to maintain even the appearance of dominance. The treasure that had dazzled Europe for a century had turned into a burden. A reminder that wealth built on debt is no foundation for lasting strength. For Americans today, the lesson is not distant. Many families live in the same contradiction that haunted Spain. Income arrives, but is already consumed by obligations. Wages exist on paper, but vanish into mortgage payments, credit card balances, and student loans before they can ease the strain of daily life. A nation may speak of prosperity, yet its people feel only the tightening grip of debt. Spain teaches us that when promises outrun reality, the cracks appear first in households, then in institutions, and finally in the nation itself. The downfall of Spain's Silver Age reminds us that strength is not measured by glittering surfaces, but by the balance beneath them. Ships loaded with treasure cannot save a country whose spending outpaces its income. Victories on the battlefield mean little when the bills that follow cannot be paid, and crowns that seem eternal can crumble quickly when their foundations are mortgaged too. Creditors. Spain, single quotes, as empire, faded not because it lacked courage or ambition, but because it lived on borrowed time and borrowed money. That story whispers across the centuries, a warning that still matters today. If even the mightiest empire could be undone by the weight of its own debts, then no nation and no family is immune. And with that thought, let us pause before moving to the next chapter. Leave a number 1 in the comments if you are still awake. The French monarchy did not simply stumble. It collapsed under the unbearable weight of its debts. By the late 18th century, the crown was drowning. Nearly half of all revenue collected by the state was consumed not by roads, schools, or the needs of its people, but by the interest owed to creditors. The richest kingdom on the European continent, proud of its culture, its palaces, and its armies, had become in many ways a debtor's prison with a throne at its center. In 1789, when revolution finally broke out, the anger of the people was fueled as much by hunger and debt as by ideas of liberty. The signs of crisis had been visible for decades. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, had dazzled Europe with Versailles and with wars that stretched across the continent, but his glory had been purchased on credit. When he died, his successors inherited not just a palace, but a mountain of debt. Louis XV added to the burden through more campaigns and extravagant spending. By the time Louis XVI ascended the throne, the kingdom was already staggering. France poured money into the 7 Years' War, only to suffer humiliating defeat. It poured money again into the American Revolution, hoping to weaken Britain, but returned home to find the treasury empty. Victories abroad meant bankruptcy at home. The crisis did not remain confined to royal ledgers. It spilled into the lives of ordinary French men and women. Bread was the staple of their diet, and when poor harvests struck in the 1780s, the price of bread soared. A family that had once managed to survive on modest wages suddenly found itself unable to afford the simplest meal. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, waiting for loaves that cost twice what they had before. Mothers wept as they handed their children crusts of bread, while rumors spread that the Queen herself had no idea of their suffering. The famous line, "Let them eat cake," though likely apocryphal, captured the distance between courtly extravagance and public despair. The government attempted reform. Ministers proposed taxing the nobility and clergy, who had long enjoyed privilege and exemption. But these elites resisted, guarding their wealth, while the burden remained on peasants and the emerging middle class. Creditors grew nervous, reluctant to extend new loans. The state's ability to pay its obligations weakened each year. In 1788, on the eve of the Revolution, France could not even borrow enough to cover its basic expenses. A monarchy that had ruled for centuries found itself unable to function, because no one trusted its promises. For Americans today, the resonance is striking. We live in a time when government debt climbs into the trillions, when interest payments consume a growing share of the budget, and when households face their own miniature versions of the same crisis. Families swipe credit cards for groceries, pay student loans long into adulthood, and find that each paycheck disappears into obligations before it can cover the basics. Like the French peasants, who faced higher bread prices, while nobles feasted in Versailles. Many citizens feel a widening gap between those who struggle daily and those whose wealth shields them from hardship. The fall of the French crown was not caused by a single riot or a single pamphlet. It was caused by years of spending more than the kingdom could afford, of borrowing to cover the difference, and of ignoring the pressure on ordinary people. When the debt grew too heavy, when bread grew too expensive, the system snapped. The guillotine that awaited Louis XVI was forged not only from revolutionary ideals, but from unpaid bills and empty stomachs. The story of France in the late 18th century reminds us that when debts grow faster than trust, collapse follows. The monarchy discovered too late that no palace, no army, and no tradition could shield it from bankruptcy. For us, looking back, the question is whether we are willing to hear the warning before our own debts lead to a similar reckoning. The collapse of France's finances was not an abstract matter of ledgers and contracts. It was something that burned itself into the daily lives of its people. By the late 1780s, the countryside was filled with despair, and the cities throbbed with anger. Bread, the cornerstone of the French diet, had become so expensive that entire families lived on crusts or went hungry. Contemporary accounts describe riots breaking out outside bakeries, women shouting at officials for flour that never came, and mobs looting carts of grain before they reached the markets. The revolution, in this sense, began not in political pamphlets or whispered philosophies, but in empty stomachs. The crown's insistence on extracting more from the common people, while sparing the nobility and clergy, deepened the misery. Tax collectors appeared in villages demanding payments that could not be met. Peasants who tilled their own land surrendered nearly everything, leaving only scraps for their families. Those who worked on estates fared no better, caught between landlords who wanted their dues and officials who demanded the king's share. The resentment was palpable. In letters from the period, farmers spoke of despair and bitterness, complaining that they lived in a kingdom rich in palaces, but poor in compassion. In the towns, the situation was no less dire. Artisans found their workshops empty of customers, because no one could afford their goods. Wages remained stagnant, while the price of flour and firewood doubled. Many sold their possessions just to buy food. Unrest spread from one quarter to another, as small protests over prices turned into wider demands for relief. The state responded with hesitation, at times deploying soldiers to keep order. But the soldiers themselves were often sympathetic. Many came from the same villages, had families who faced the same hunger, and were weary of serving a monarchy that seemed blind to suffering. Meanwhile, Versailles sparkled as though nothing was wrong. Balls, banquets, and operas continued, giving the impression that the royal family lived in another world altogether. This contrast was not lost on the people. Gossip exaggerated the extravagance of the queen, who became a symbol of indifference. Whether or not Marie Antoinette ever uttered the infamous words about eating cake, she became the target of popular rage, the face of a monarchy accused of feasting while its people starved. The disconnect between rulers and ruled grew dangerous. When the crown attempted reform by calling the Estates General, the gathering of clergy, nobility, and commoners, it hoped to solve the financial crisis. Instead, it created a platform for grievances. The Third Estate, representing the common people, quickly realized that it carried the burdens of the nation without enjoying its privileges. Their anger, fueled by hunger and humiliation, ignited the push for a new order. For Americans today, the echoes are unsettling. Rising rents and grocery prices leave families with less food on their tables. Credit card bills and medical expenses squeeze households until paychecks vanish almost as soon as they arrive. Many feel that leaders live in a different world, insulated from the hardships that define ordinary lives. Just as French peasants and artisans once looked toward Versailles with resentment, so too do modern citizens often look toward Washington or Wall Street with suspicion. The story of France in the years before the Revolution is a reminder that when the gap between rulers and ruled grows too wide, and when the cost of survival outpaces the means of ordinary people, unrest becomes inevitable. Debt was not only a financial problem for the monarchy, it was the spark that lit the fire of resentment. Bread was scarce, trust was gone, and no amount of royal display could disguise the truth. The kingdom was approaching a breaking point, one that would sweep away centuries of tradition in a storm of anger and hope. The unraveling of France's monarchy was not only about empty granaries and soaring bread prices. It was also about a government that could no longer convince anyone to lend it money. By the 1780s, France had accumulated such staggering debts that even the wealthiest bankers hesitated to extend credit. In 1788 alone, nearly half of all state revenue went directly to servicing old loans, leaving precious little for the army, the navy, or public works. The crown was trapped in a vicious cycle. It borrowed to fight wars, then borrowed more to pay the interest on those loans, until finally, there was nothing left to pledge. Louis XVI did not ignore the problem. He turned to some of the sharpest financial minds of his time. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker who served as finance minister, tried to bring transparency by publishing the first public report on the crown's finances. His Compte Rendu was meant to reassure lenders, but instead it revealed how dire the situation had become. Revenues were dwarfed by expenses, and without fundamental reform, collapse was certain. Later ministers, Charles Alexandre de Coligny and Etienne Charles de Brienne, attempted more drastic measures. They proposed new taxes that would fall on the nobility and the clergy, groups that had long enjoyed exemptions. But the privileged estates resisted fiercely. Every plan stalled in the face of entrenched interests, and the monarchy's authority weakened further. As reform failed, the crisis deepened. Creditors stopped buying royal bonds. In Paris, rumors spread that the crown might soon default altogether, echoing the memory of Spain's earlier bankruptcies. Officials scrambled to raise money by selling offices, monopolies, and even titles of nobility, but these desperate measures produced only temporary relief. By the summer of 1788, France could not even meet its day-to-day expenses. Government employees went unpaid, suppliers refused to deliver without cash, and whispers of bankruptcy spread through every marketplace, and the people, of course, felt the consequences. Inflation in food prices already gnawed at their earnings, but now shortages of credit meant shortages of goods. Merchants who could not secure loans cut back on production. Farmers who could not find buyers for their grain hoarded it, driving prices higher still. The economy ground to a halt, and resentment boiled over. For the poor, this was not a debate about finance. It was the daily experience of going without. The Estates General of 1789 was called precisely because the monarchy could no longer rule alone. It was not simply a meeting of tradition, but an act of desperation, a last attempt to secure legitimacy and perhaps unlock new revenue streams. But in opening the door, Louis unwittingly invited challenge. The Third Estate, representing commoners, quickly realized the depth of royal weakness. If the king could not tax the nobility, if he could not manage his own finances, then perhaps he could not govern at all. What began as a financial crisis evolved into a political revolution. For Americans, today, the lesson is striking. When debt consumes too much of a budget, whether for a household or for a nation, choices vanish. Families who spend half their income on loan payments have nothing left for emergencies or opportunities. Governments that spend half their revenue on interest cannot invest in their people. The inability to reform, to cut spending, or raise fair taxes leaves systems brittle. And when trust in leaders collapses, financial weakness becomes political weakness. Almost overnight, France, in 1788 and 1789, was not destroyed by an enemy army. It was destroyed by the loss of confidence in its own solvency and its own leadership. The inability to borrow, to pay, and to reform signaled to the people that the old order was finished. The revolution that followed may have been fueled by ideals, but it was sparked by debts too heavy to bear and by rulers who could no longer command belief. By the summer of 1789, France had crossed the line from financial crisis to political upheaval. The Estates General, called by Louis XVI in desperation, quickly became the stage on which the monarchy's weakness was exposed to the world. The king had hoped that gathering the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commons, would provide legitimacy for new taxes. Instead, it gave the commoners a platform to demand change. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, it was not only a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration that the people, not the crown, now held the authority to decide the nation's future. The monarchy's financial paralysis had bled into every institution. Soldiers were restless, sometimes refusing orders to disperse crowds, because they sympathized with the protesters. Grain riots broke out across the countryside. In Paris, the fear of famine and anger at the crown fused into violence. On July 14th, the storming of the Bastille was more than the fall of a prison. It was the fall of the illusion that the monarchy still held firm control. Behind that prison's walls were only a handful of prisoners, yet its destruction became the signal that the old order was collapsing. What made this moment irreversible was the crown's inability to recover financially. Even after the Bastille fell, even after revolution spread, Louis still attempted negotiations. He still hoped to reassure lenders and restore stability. But creditors no longer trusted him. Without money, the monarchy could not fund its army. Without a reliable army, it could not suppress unrest. Without the means to pay, it could not negotiate with its own people. The financial crisis that had begun with unpaid bills had now become a political crisis that no compromise could heal. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, became the lightning rod for popular anger. Pamphlets circulated accusing her of lavish spending while families starved. Some were exaggerations, others outright fabrications, but they all carried weight because the contrast between Versailles and the streets of Paris was undeniable. The palace shone with chandeliers, while the city was dark with hunger. The image of royal extravagance fed the belief that the monarchy not only mismanaged its money, but also cared nothing for its people. In the assembly, debates raged over new constitutions, over the rights of citizens, and over how to handle the mounting debts. Many argued that the monarchy itself was the problem, that a government which could not balance its own accounts had no legitimacy to rule. As reforms turned radical, the king's power shrank further. Attempts to flee, to negotiate, or to rally, loyalists all failed. Each failure was tied to the same truth. Without credit, without trust, the monarchy was powerless. For Americans today, this stage of France's revolution holds a warning. Financial weakness can strip away authority faster than any external enemy. A government that cannot pay its obligations loses the confidence of its people. When trust is gone, legitimacy follows. Many families know this feeling on a smaller scale. A credit score drops, a mortgage payment is missed, and suddenly choices disappear. For nations, the stakes are higher, but the mechanism is the same. Debt without balance turns strength into fragility. By 1791, France was no longer ruled by a king in practice, even though Louis still wore the crown. The assembly had taken the power to govern, and the people in the streets had taken the power to enforce it. The monarchy had been reduced to a symbol, a relic of a system that could no longer function. Its debts had finally caught up, transforming a financial crisis into a revolution that could not be reversed. The end of the French monarchy came not with a sudden foreign invasion, but with the relentless tightening of debts and the anger of a nation that could no longer bear them. By 1792, the revolution had gathered unstoppable momentum. The National Assembly had rewritten laws, the people had taken control of Paris, and the king himself was viewed as a liability rather than a leader. In August of that year, crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, the last symbolic seat of royal power within the city. Louis XVI, once the most powerful man in Europe, was reduced to a prisoner in his own capital. The charges against him were not simply about tyranny or neglect. They were about betrayal, about a king who had wasted the resources of his nation, who had allowed debts to grow so large that hunger spread like wildfire. Pamphlets portrayed him as indifferent, as someone who dined well while his people starved. And whether fair or not, the image stuck. The trial that followed was a formality. The king was declared guilty and sentenced to death. In January 1793, he was led to the guillotine. Witnesses recorded the silence of the crowd just before the blade fell, and then the roar that followed. With that act, centuries of monarchy ended in an instant. But the execution was more than punishment for a man. It was the execution of a system that had placed debt above its people, that had taxed the poor while shielding the privileged, that had borrowed and borrowed until there was nothing left to borrow. The guillotine was built as much from unpaid bills as from sharpened steel. Marie Antoinette followed her husband to the scaffold months later, her name forever linked with extravagance in the face of despair. The monarchy's debts had cut through its very legitimacy, and with legitimacy gone, so too was its survival. For Americans listening today, the lesson is sobering. When governments live beyond their means, when they protect privilege while neglecting the majority, trust erodes. When debts consume revenue, when citizens feel squeezed by taxes or prices that outpace their wages, the bond between ruler and ruled frays. Collapse does not come overnight, but when it comes, it can be swift and final. The French monarchy did not fall because foreign armies defeated it. It fell because its own people no longer believed it could provide a future. The revolution that replaced the monarchy was messy, often violent, and far from perfect. Yet it carried within it a truth that Spain had already hinted at, and France proved beyond doubt. Thrones can be toppled, not only by swords, but by ledgers. Debt has the power to undo what armies cannot. As we reflect on this story from the late 18th century, it is worth remembering how debt shapes our own time. It decides the fate of families at their kitchen tables, and it decides the fate of nations on the world stage. If France's crown could not withstand its weight, no one can afford to ignore it. So let us close this chapter with the reminder that history whispers to those willing to listen. And if you are still with me, still awake as the echoes of revolution fade, leave a number 1 in the comments. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the greatest power in Europe, but its victory carried a hidden price. In 1815, after Waterloo, the nation celebrated the defeat of Napoleon and the end of 2 decades of war. Crowds filled the streets of London, church bells rang across the countryside, and newspapers hailed Britain as the defender of liberty. Yet beneath the triumph was a staggering burden. The national debt had soared to levels never seen before, rising from around £240 million in 1793, when the wars began, to more than £800 million by their end. Interest payments alone consumed a huge portion of the government's budget, and the Crown's ability to act was constrained not by foreign enemies, but by its own ledgers. This debt was not abstract. It shaped the daily lives of ordinary Britons. Taxes multiplied during the war years. A duty on malt made beer more expensive. Levies on soap, candles, and even windows fell hardest on the poor, who could least afford them. The war may have ended at Waterloo, but the tax system remained in place to service the debt. Farmers grumbled under the Corn Laws, which protected landowners by keeping grain prices high, but forced laborers to pay more for bread. Artisans and urban workers saw their earnings swallowed by the cost of living, while landlords and creditors collected steady returns. The empire had defeated Napoleon, but the people who filled its armies and its factories often felt defeated themselves. The imbalance produced resentment. Radical voices called attention to the contrast between the sacrifices of common soldiers and the profits of the wealthy. Pamphlets asked why men who had bled for Britain returned to poverty, while bondholders in the city of London grew richer. In industrial towns where the new working class labored in mills, hardship was visible. In every street, crowds gathered to demand reform, not only in politics but in economics, believing that a system weighted so heavily toward debt repayment offered them no future. What made Britain's case remarkable was its ability to survive despite this weight. Unlike Spain or France, the British government maintained the confidence of creditors. The Bank of England, founded in the 17th century, had developed tools to manage debt more effectively. Consols perpetual bonds that paid interest, without requiring repayment of the principal, allowed the state to stretch its obligations far into the future. As long as investors trusted that interest would be paid, Britain could continue. Yet, this very survival came at the cost of social unrest. Economic policy was designed less to relieve the people than to satisfy creditors, and the imbalance fed decades of discontent. For Americans today, the comparison is clear. The United States enjoys the trust of global markets, issuing treasury bonds that investors around the world buy with confidence. But the weight of that debt is still real. Interest payments consume growing portions of the federal budget, limiting what can be spent on schools, healthcare, or infrastructure. At the household level, the same pattern repeats. Credit cards, mortgages, and loans may be manageable when confidence is high, but they dictate choices every day. Families sacrifice comfort to meet obligations, just as Britain sacrificed social harmony to preserve financial credibility. Britain's victory at Waterloo secured its empire for a century. Yet the shadow of debt followed every step. Behind the grand parades and patriotic songs was the quiet truth that no triumph comes without cost. For the crown and its people, that cost was measured not only in lives lost on the battlefield, but also in decades of payments that shaped their economy and their society. The lesson, both then and now, is that victory may bring glory, but the bill always arrives, and paying it can transform triumph into a quieter, slower kind of struggle. The years that followed Waterloo were years of uneasy peace for Britain. On the surface, the nation basked in triumph. Napoleon was gone, the continent subdued, and Britain stood alone as the unrivaled naval and financial power of Europe. Yet for ordinary Britons, life in the aftermath of victory was far from glorious. The war had ended, but the taxes that paid for it remained. Every loaf of bread, every pint of beer, every bar of soap carried the imprint of the national debt. The celebration of empire belonged to the elites, while the burden of servicing the loans fell upon the backs of the people. One of the most bitter policies was the Corn Laws. Enacted in 1815, the very year of Waterloo, landowners in Parliament insisted that foreign grain should be restricted to keep domestic prices high. For them, it was a way to protect their profits and stabilize rural estates. For workers and the urban poor, it was a sentence to pay more for the most basic food. Bread, which made up the bulk of a family's diet, became painfully expensive. Mothers who once managed to feed their households on modest wages now struggled to stretch a day's pay into meals. The very men who had fought against Napoleon returned to find that their reward for service was a hunger they had not known before. The discontent spilled into the streets. Protests broke out across industrial towns in northern England, where mill workers demanded relief. In 1819, at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, a peaceful gathering of tens of thousands calling for reform ended in tragedy when cavalry charged the crowd. The event, remembered as the Peterloo Massacre, revealed how thin the line was between stability and unrest. The government, fearful of revolution like that which had consumed France, clamped down with harsh laws against assembly and radical newspapers. Yet repression did not erase the reality. The debt-driven tax system kept squeezing families, and resentment only grew. For the wealthy, the war's end had a different meaning. Bondholders and creditors enjoyed steady returns. The government's commitment to service its debt ensured their security. In London's financial district, the city, prosperity continued. with investors confident that the Bank of England would maintain the flow of interest payments. But in coal towns and textile mills, in the alleys of London's East End, the contrast was glaring. The very system that sustained Britain's financial reputation seemed designed to punish its workers. This inequality became the seedbed of political reform. The 1820s and 1830s witnessed a rising movement for broader representation, culminating in the Reform Act of 1832. Demands for a fairer system, for lower food prices, and for accountability in government all found their roots in the hardship of the post-war years. Debt, in this way, did not just shape the economy, it reshaped politics, forcing Britain to adapt or risk the fate of France. For Americans today, the echoes are not hard to hear. Tax systems that appear neutral often weigh heavily on those least able to pay. Families notice when the price of food climbs while their wages stagnate. Workers sense when sacrifices are demanded from them but rewards flow elsewhere. The frustration that boiled over at Peterloo was born not simply from hunger, but from the recognition that a government can celebrate victory while leaving its people in struggle. Britain, after Waterloo, shows us that triumph abroad does not guarantee peace at home. The cost of servicing the debt created by war fell unevenly, sharpening divisions between rich and poor, city and countryside, rulers and ruled. And though Britain avoided the kind of revolution that consumed France, it did so only by gradually bending under pressure. The lesson is plain: a society cannot remain stable if victory for the few translates into hardship for the many. Britain's survival in the 19th century owed less to the glory of its armies than to the quiet power of its financial institutions. While Spain had frightened its creditors with repeated defaults, and France had collapsed under the pressure of unpaid loans, Britain managed to maintain the confidence of investors. This trust was not a matter of chance. It was carefully cultivated by the state and anchored in the role of the Bank of England, which acted as the kingdom's financial heart. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's national debt had ballooned to more than £800 million, a sum so vast that it dwarfed the annual revenue of the government. Yet bondholders in London continued to purchase government securities, known as consols. These were perpetual bonds that paid interest indefinitely, but never required the repayment of principal. To modern ears, this might sound like a trick, but in practice it allowed Britain to stretch its obligations far into the future, turning crushing short-term debts into manageable long-term commitments. Investors, reassured that interest would be paid reliably, accepted the arrangement. The system gave Britain breathing space and, more importantly, credibility. The key was confidence. People believed that the government would honor its promises because it had built a reputation for doing so. Taxes remained high, often painfully so for ordinary families, but they provided a steady stream of revenue that proved Britain's commitment. Unlike in Spain, creditors did not fear sudden default. Unlike in France, they did not suspect that political chaos would overturn agreements. The Bank of England played the role of guarantor, managing the issuance of bonds, stabilizing the currency, and assuring investors that the Crown's word was reliable. Yet this stability had its price. Servicing the debt consumed nearly half of government expenditure in the early 19th century. That meant less money for public improvements, less for relief of the poor, and little investment in the kinds of projects that might have lightened the burdens of the working class. Bondholders thrived while factory workers and farmers endured years of hardship. The state's financial machinery served the needs of creditors first and its citizens second. This paradox shaped Britain's society. On one hand, it avoided the revolutions that shook Europe because it never lost the trust of markets. On the other, it created an environment of simmering discontent. Radical movements grew, newspapers railed against corruption, and reformers demanded that the cost of empire be shared more fairly. The ability to manage debt, preserved Britain's global position. But it also forced the nation to confront questions of justice at home. For Americans today, the parallel is close at hand. The United States Treasury issues bonds with the confidence that buyers around the world will accept them. Investors trust that America will honor its debts, and so the system continues. But the interest paid on those bonds grows each year, consuming a larger share of the federal budget. Just as in 19th century Britain, this limits what can be spent on schools, healthcare, or infrastructure. The government meets its obligations to creditors, but citizens often feel neglected. Families, too, experience the same cycle. They refinance mortgages, roll over credit card balances, and stretch payments into the future. As long as confidence holds, the system survives, but the strain is real. The lesson from Britain is that credibility is powerful, but costly. It can sustain an empire for generations, but it can also hollow out the lives of its people. Soldiers at Waterloo fought for victory, but it was the bankers in London who secured Britain's endurance. And while the crown basked in glory, ordinary Britons paid the bill through years of taxes and sacrifice. The empire lived, but the cost was written into every loaf of bread and every pint of beer. The decades after Waterloo revealed a troubling contradiction. Britain was the strongest power in Europe, its navy ruled the seas, and its empire expanded across continents, yet its society at home was restless and divided. The enormous debt from the Napoleonic Wars continued to shape every decision. Taxes remained high to pay creditors, and the weight of those taxes fell unevenly. Landowners and financiers prospered, while laborers and artisans carried the heavier burden. Victory abroad had been bought at the expense of hardship at home, and the people knew it. The Corn Laws, passed in 1815, remained a constant source of bitterness. By protecting the price of domestic grain, Parliament ensured that landowners profited, while the poor paid more for bread. Families that lived from loaf to loaf could not escape the sense that their hunger was being engineered to benefit the wealthy. The policy became a rallying point for reformers. Pamphlets, meetings, and petitions spread across the country, demanding change not only in economic policy, but in representation itself. If the system of government was built to favor elites, then perhaps it was the system that had to change. The unrest reached dramatic peaks. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 had already revealed the willingness of authorities to use force against protesters. In the years that followed, more gatherings turned violent. Workers in industrial towns demanded shorter hours, fairer wages, and relief from high food prices. Riots erupted in rural areas where farmers destroyed threshing machines they believed were stealing their livelihoods. The government answered with repression, passing laws that restricted public assembly and censored radical newspapers. But repression only deepened the conviction that the Crown and Parliament were serving creditors rather than citizens. Behind the protests lay the shadow of debt. Every new tax, every restriction, was justified as necessary to maintain Britain's financial credibility. Ministers argued that to miss a single interest payment would ruin the nation's standing. For the bondholders in London, this was reassuring. For the laborers in Manchester or the farmers in Kent, it was infuriating. They saw their sacrifices not as contributions to national strength, but as tribute to distant financiers. Confidence in the government's ability to represent all its people began to erode. This discontent fed into the larger movement for reform. In the 1820s and 1830s, demands grew louder for broader suffrage and fairer representation in Parliament. The Reform Act of 1832 was the first response, redistributing seats and slightly widening the electorate. It did not solve the problem entirely, but it showed that the pressure of debt and inequality was reshaping politics. The monarchy remained intact, the financial system continued to function, but the old order could not survive unchanged. Britain had avoided revolution, but it had done so by yielding to reform born from economic strain. For Americans today, the lesson is vivid. High levels of government debt shape choices, not only in budgets, but in society. When interest consumes a growing share of revenue, other priorities are sacrificed, and citizens notice. When inequality grows, resentment follows, and with resentment comes instability. Households experience the same pattern. Families who dedicate most of their income to servicing loans have little left for the things that build stability. Over time, frustration builds, not just with lenders, but with the system itself. Britain's story, in the decades after Waterloo, shows that the burden of debt does not remain confined to financial charts. It moves into the streets, into the lives of workers and farmers, and into the debates that shape the future of governments. The empire survived, but its society was forced to adapt under pressure. In that adaptation lies the warning. Debt may sustain power for a time, but it always demands payment, and the longer the payment is delayed, the higher the social cost becomes. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain remained the most powerful empire on earth, yet its triumphs were always shadowed by the legacy of debt. The victory at Waterloo had secured dominance over Europe, and the growing reach of the Navy extended Britain's influence across the world. But beneath the banners of empire lay the quiet truth that much of this strength was mortgaged. Generations of Britons lived with the consequences of wars fought decades earlier. The debt never disappeared. It was managed, reshaped, and extended through financial instruments, but it lingered like a permanent companion. Servicing it consumed enormous sums, shaping every budget that Parliament produced. Roads were built slowly, schools lagged behind, and relief for the poor remained limited. Creditors were always paid first. Ordinary families learned that victory for the crown did not mean comfort for the people. Wages remained under pressure, food remained expensive, and taxes never fell back to what they had been before the wars. The empire stood tall abroad, but at home many citizens bent under its weight. And yet Britain's system held. Unlike Spain, which had defaulted, or France, which had collapsed, Britain maintained the confidence of its lenders. That confidence allowed it to borrow again when new challenges arose, whether in the Crimea or in colonial conflicts. The crown paid its bills, even when it meant squeezing its own people, and for creditors, that reliability mattered more than fairness. Britain's endurance was as much a product of financial credibility as of military power. Still, the lesson cannot be ignored. The cost of debt was not merely financial, it was social and political. It fueled unrest, forced reforms, and reshaped the relationship between rulers and ruled. The Reform Act of 1832, the rise of organized labor, and the constant debates over free trade versus protection all grew from the pressure debt had placed on society. Debt did not destroy Britain outright, but it transformed it, reminding the world that even victors cannot escape the bills of war. For Americans today, the message is plain. Success on the world stage does not erase the arithmetic of obligations. Military strength, economic power, and national pride mean little if the weight of debt continues to grow faster than the means to manage it. Families know this at their kitchen tables. Nations know it in their treasuries. Britain's long struggle with the cost of victory shows that debts do not vanish when the parades end. They remain, shaping lives long after the drums fall silent. So, as we close this chapter on Britain, let us remember that the greatest empire of the 19th century was as much a debtor as a conqueror. Its victories were real, its glory undeniable, but its bills were constant. Debt may not have toppled the throne as it did in France, but it never released its grip. And if you are still awake, as we step away from Waterloo's echoes and into the next story, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Habsburg monarchy endured for centuries. Its coat of arms stretched across Central Europe, from the Alpine valleys to the plains of Hungary. Yet by the 19th century, the empire that once claimed to rule half of Europe was showing deep fractures. Wars had drained its coffers, debts had mounted beyond measure, and the unity of its people had begun to unravel. What brought the empire to its knees was not one decisive defeat on the battlefield, but the slow suffocation of its treasury, a weakness that creditors exploited and subjects could no longer ignore. The Habsburgs had long carried the burden of defending Christendom against the Ottoman Empire. For generations, fortresses along the Danube and campaigns into the Balkans consumed wealth at a staggering pace. Later came the Napoleonic Wars, where Austria faced repeated humiliation at the hands of France. Each conflict required loans, and each loan carried interest that outlived the war itself. By the early 19th century, Austria's debt had grown to such levels that almost half the state's income went directly to servicing it. Historians note that the empire declared formal bankruptcy in 1811, effectively wiping out the value of much of its currency. It was a humiliation not just for its rulers, but for every citizen, who watched the coins in their purses lose value overnight. The shock of that bankruptcy reverberated for decades. Trust in the monarchy's financial promises crumbled, and Austria found it harder to borrow at reasonable rates. Officials tried to restore confidence with reforms, but creditors remained wary. The empire was too vast and too divided to present a stable picture. German provinces, Hungarian nobles, Italian territories, and Slavic lands all pulled in different directions, making taxation uneven and spending unpredictable. To keep the machine running, the crown leaned ever more heavily on its core lands, in Austria and Bohemia, squeezing peasants and merchants alike. For ordinary subjects, the experience was painfully familiar. Taxes rose year after year, while inflation eroded the value of what little they earned. Peasants in Hungary complained of levies that left them with barely enough grain to survive. Merchants in Vienna found trade hampered by a tangle of tolls and duties, many of them pledged directly to creditors rather than the crown. Even soldiers grumbled, sometimes waiting months for pay that was meager when it finally arrived. An empire that once promised protection and order now seemed to deliver only demands. The result was a society simmering with discontent. By the 1840s, nationalist movements began to stir in Hungary, Italy, and Bohemia. While their calls for independence were rooted in identity, they were also fueled by economic frustration. People saw no benefit in belonging to an empire that consumed their labor to pay debts accumulated in wars fought far from their homes. The Habsburgs' failure to manage their finances made them appear not only distant rulers, but incompetent ones. For Americans today, the echoes are clear. Debt does not always topple governments in one dramatic moment. Often, it erodes trust slowly, leaving families and nations alike frustrated. A household that spends too much on interest cannot invest in its future. A government that devotes nearly all its resources to past obligations has little left to meet present needs. Just as Austria's citizens began to question why they should sacrifice for an empire that gave them nothing in return, many today wonder why their taxes seem to cover interest payments more than improvements in their lives. The Habsburg experience shows that debt can hollow out not just treasuries, but the very bonds that hold diverse societies together. Without trust in the crown's ability to manage resources fairly, subjects turned away. And once loyalty frays, even the most ancient dynasties find their thrones less secure. After the financial collapse of 1811, when the Habsburg crown admitted it could not meet its obligations and slashed the value of its paper currency, life for ordinary people across the empire changed dramatically. Overnight, savings disappeared. A shopkeeper in Vienna who had carefully set aside guilders found that the coins and notes in his drawer could buy only a fraction of what they had the week before. Farmers who brought grain to market demanded higher prices because they knew that money was losing its worth. Soldiers, paid in devalued notes, discovered that their wages could no longer feed their families. The monarchy's bankruptcy was not just an accounting event. It was a catastrophe that seeped into kitchens, workshops, and taverns. The decades that followed were marked by a constant tension between the needs of the crown and the interests of its people. Taxes remained heavy because interest payments on surviving debts had to be made to keep any shred of credibility. In Hungary, peasants grumbled that they paid for wars they had not chosen. Their harvests sent away while their own tables sat bare. In northern Italy, merchants complained of duties and tariffs that strangled commerce. Many of them pledged directly to service foreign loans. Even in Austria's heartland, the resentment was real. Viennese craftsmen and small traders saw their costs rise and their customers shrink, while the court in Schönbrunn seemed to carry on as though nothing had changed. This disconnect between rulers and ruled deepened the fractures of an already diverse empire. The Habsburg domains were a patchwork of languages and loyalties: German, Hungarian, Czech, Italian, Croat, and more. For centuries, loyalty to the dynasty had been enough to bind them. But in the wake of financial failure, that loyalty frayed. Why should a Hungarian farmer sacrifice his grain for a Vienna that seemed careless with its treasury? Why should a Czech merchant pay taxes to a crown that squandered them on lost battles in faraway lands? National identity mixed with economic grievance, and the result was a growing storm. The resentment also seeped into the army, long the pride of the Habsburgs. Officers complained in letters about shortages of supplies and long delays in pay. Ordinary soldiers deserted, unwilling to fight for a crown that seemed unable to honor its promises. Each default, each delayed payment, was a crack in the authority of the monarchy. By the 1840s, the cracks had widened so far that they threatened to split the empire apart. For the people themselves, the memory of the 1811 bankruptcy lingered like a scar. Older generations told their children how one morning their money had turned worthless, how carefully saved coins had become empty tokens. It became a story of betrayal, passed down as proof that the crown could not be trusted. Trust, once lost, is not easily rebuilt. The monarchy attempted reforms, but each new tax, each new levy, was seen through the lens of past failure. For Americans today, this history feels uncomfortably relevant. Families who have lived through inflation know the feeling of seeing money shrink in their hands. A paycheck arrives, but groceries cost more, rent rises, and savings seem to evaporate. Confidence in institutions weakens when promises of stability collapse. The Habsburgs faced this on a grand scale, but the emotions are the same. People begin to ask why they should trust leaders who mismanage resources, why they should sacrifice for a system that does not protect them. By the eve of 1848, when revolutions erupted across Europe, the Habsburg Empire was already brittle. Financial mismanagement had left scars that political repression could not hide. Debt had drained not only the treasury but also the patience of its people. The monarchy still stood, but its foundations trembled. What followed would show that once loyalty is broken, no dynasty, no matter how ancient, is safe. By the middle of the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire was not only weighed down by debt, but also shackled to the demands of international creditors. In earlier centuries, monarchs had borrowed primarily from local elites or wealthy merchants within their own borders. But after the bankruptcy of 1811, Austria's credit was so tarnished that foreign financiers demanded strict conditions before they would lend again. Bankers in London, Paris, and Frankfurt treated the Habsburg crown not as a partner, but as a risk that had to be carefully controlled. Austria had survived its collapse, but it had lost its financial independence. To secure new loans, the monarchy often pledged revenues directly to creditors. Customs duties, tolls, and even taxes on salt or tobacco were diverted before they reached the imperial treasury. In practice, This meant that large parts of the empire's economy were run not for the benefit of its people, but for the satisfaction of bondholders abroad. Ministers in Vienna spoke less about policies to improve trade or ease burdens at home, and more about the necessity of maintaining the confidence of the markets. The empire, vast and diverse, was effectively governed by ledgers as much as bylaws. The consequences of this dependency reached deep into daily life. Farmers in Galicia complained that they sold their crops at fair prices. Yet the taxes imposed on them seemed to vanish into the pockets of bankers who lived far from their fields. Merchants in Trieste grumbled about tariffs that made their goods more expensive, knowing that much of the revenue never stayed in the port city, but was shipped out as interest payments. Even soldiers muttered that their sacrifices in distant wars were meaningless when their wages were late, the money drained away to satisfy debts rather than to support the army. What made the situation more corrosive was the sense of humiliation. The Habsburg dynasty prided itself on being one of the oldest ruling houses in Europe, tracing its lineage back centuries. Yet now, it was dependent on the goodwill of foreign bankers who neither wore crowns nor commanded armies. For proud nobles in Vienna and Budapest, this was galling. For common people, it was further proof that the empire no longer served them. A government that answered first to creditors, rather than to its citizens, could hardly command loyalty. This loss of autonomy also fueled nationalist movements. Hungarians pointed to the empire's financial mismanagement as a reason to demand greater self-rule. Italians argued that Vienna taxed their provinces heavily, only to pay debts that had nothing to do with their interests. Czechs and Croats echoed the same complaint. The empire was supposed to be a union under the Habsburg crown, but the weight of debt turned it into a collection of unwilling contributors, forced to pay for mistakes they had not made. For Americans today, the pattern is strikingly familiar. Nations that rely heavily on foreign creditors often find their policies constrained. Households know the feeling as well. A family deep in debt finds that its choices are no longer its own. It may want to invest in the future, in education or new opportunities, but creditors demand payment first. The Habsburgs faced this same reality on the scale of an empire. Ambitions for reform, for modernization, for national pride were hemmed in by the relentless obligation to pay interest on old debts. The result was a monarchy that looked imposing but was hollow inside. Its palaces still gleamed, its armies still marched, and its ceremonies still impressed visitors, but everyone knew that real control lay elsewhere. When foreign creditors hesitated, the empire faltered. When markets demanded higher interest, the people paid with more taxes. The Habsburg crown still sat on its throne, but the empire's destiny was written in contracts signed with bankers beyond its borders. This dependency eroded not only financial independence, but also political legitimacy. Subjects who already felt divided by language and culture now shared a common grievance: the sense that they were taxed for debts that brought them no benefit. In that shared resentment lay the seeds of rebellion, a force that would burst forth when the revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe. By the year 1848, the Habsburg monarchy faced a perfect storm. Decades of debt had weakened its treasury, years of mismanagement had sapped public trust, and the growing tide of nationalism across Europe now surged into the streets of Vienna, Budapest, and Milan. The revolutions of 1848 are often remembered as a clash of ideas: liberalism against absolutism, nationalism against empire. But beneath those ideals was the hard arithmetic of a government that could no longer afford to govern. When revolts erupted in March, the monarchy was already stretched to its limit. Soldiers were restless after months of delayed wages, and officers knew the treasury had little money left to supply or feed them. Ministers begged foreign creditors for fresh loans to stabilize the situation, but confidence in Vienna was fragile. Memories of the 1811 bankruptcy lingered, and lenders demanded harsh conditions. The empire that had once claimed to protect Europe was now dependent on others for its survival. On the streets, hunger mingled with politics. In Vienna, workers marched not only for constitutional rights, but also for relief from taxes and high food prices. In Budapest, Hungarian leaders demanded autonomy, fueled by resentment that their contributions to the empire vanished into debts that served no Hungarian purpose. In Milan and Venice, Italians rose against Habsburg garrisons, convinced that their provinces were milked to pay for wars and obligations elsewhere. Across the empire, the financial strain turned regional grievances into a common cause. The monarchy tried to respond, with a mixture of concessions and repression. The empire's long-serving chancellor resigned and fled, a symbol of how deep the crisis had become. The emperor promised reforms, new constitutions, and some degree of local self-rule. But promises required money to enforce, and money was the one resource the monarchy lacked. Troops sent to restore order were poorly supplied, sometimes forced to live off the land, which only deepened resentment among civilians. Without steady pay, their loyalty was uncertain. In some places, soldiers joined the crowds rather than firing upon them. The revolutions of 1848 were not entirely successful. Many uprisings were eventually suppressed, but they revealed the fragility of the Habsburg system. Even when the monarchy regained control, it did so at immense cost, both financially and politically. The crown had been forced to rely on emergency loans, some from abroad, others raised through desperate measures at home. Each new obligation pushed the empire further into dependency. The image of imperial grandeur was preserved, but it was an illusion maintained by borrowed money and temporary force. For the people, the aftermath was bitter. Promises of reform often faded once the immediate threat had passed, but the taxes remained. Families still bore the cost of servicing debts. Even as their calls for justice were dismissed, the cycle repeated. The crown borrowed, the people paid, and resentment deepened. The empire survived 1848, but the revolts left a scar that never healed. Subjects who had once seen the Habsburgs as protectors now saw them as creditors, agents, more concerned with appeasing lenders than with meeting the needs of their people. For Americans today, the story feels familiar in quieter ways. Debt weakens institutions long before collapse is visible. It limits choices, erodes trust, and magnifies every crisis. A government caught between creditors and citizens often struggles to satisfy either. Households experience the same tension. When loans pile up, every emergency becomes harder to face, every promise harder to keep. The Habsburgs in 1848 discovered that when debts accumulate faster than trust, even centuries of tradition cannot guarantee stability. The revolutions did not end the Habsburg monarchy, but they marked the beginning of its long decline. Financial weakness had stripped away its resilience. It could still command armies and build palaces, but it could not inspire confidence in its people. The empire survived the flames of 1848, yet beneath the surface, its foundations were already crumbling. The story of the Habsburgs is not a tale of sudden collapse, but of slow unraveling. An empire that endured for centuries yet grew weaker with each passing decade as the weight of debt pressed down. Unlike France, the dynasty did not meet its end at the guillotine, and unlike Spain, it was not bankrupted into irrelevance within a single lifetime. Instead, the Habsburg monarchy drifted, sustained by habit and tradition, but hollowed from within. Its throne remained, but its authority was chipped away each time creditors dictated terms and subjects were forced to shoulder the cost. After the revolutions of 1848, the monarchy limped forward, borrowing still more to rebuild its armies and pacify its provinces. It remained a major European power on paper, but in reality, it was increasingly dependent on foreign financiers and on fragile compromises with its restive peoples. In Hungary, Nationalists demanded greater autonomy, arguing that their sacrifices funded debts that had nothing to do with them. In Italy, revolts would flare again until provinces eventually broke free. In Bohemia and other Slavic lands, resentment grew over the sense that Vienna took much and gave little. Across the empire, diversity that had once been a source of strength became a source of fracture, sharpened by economic hardship. By the late 19th century, the Habsburg monarchy had become a patchwork held together less by loyalty than by inertia. The Compromise of 1867 created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, a desperate measure to appease Hungarian demands while keeping the empire intact. It bought time, but it did not solve the underlying problems. Debt still consumed resources. Reforms came too slowly, and the monarchy remained a step behind the rising forces of nationalism and industrial change. When World War I finally came, in 1914, the empire entered the conflict already weakened. By 1918, it disintegrated completely. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries scattered into fragments. For the people who lived under the Habsburg crown, the decline was not measured only in political shifts but in daily burdens. Taxes weighed heavily, wages lagged, and opportunities dwindled. Families sacrificed to sustain a monarchy that seemed increasingly distant and increasingly powerless. The grandeur of Vienna's palaces and the rituals of the court masked the reality that the empire was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. For Americans today, the Habsburg story offers a warning that feels familiar. Debt is not always a dramatic collapse. It can be a slow erosion. A government can appear strong, its traditions intact, even as trust weakens and obligations multiply. Families to know this pattern. Bills are paid month after month, but savings vanish, and the sense of stability slips away. What looks solid from the outside may in truth be fragile. The Habsburgs teach us that resilience without reform and authority without balance cannot last forever. The empire that once claimed to defend Christendom and to unite nations under one crown was undone not by a single enemy, but by the steady weight of its own obligations. Its story is a reminder that even the longest-lived dynasties cannot survive. When debts outgrow trust, and if you are still awake, as we leave behind the fading echoes of Vienna and turn to the next story, leave a number 1 in the comments. The fall of the Russian monarchy in 1917 is often told as a story of revolution, ideology, and war. But beneath the banners and slogans lay a simple fact. The empire was drowning in debt. By the time Nicholas II led his country into the First World War, Russia already carried enormous financial burdens. The war multiplied them to catastrophic levels. Between 1914 and 1917, government spending quadrupled, and nearly half of that spending came from borrowed money. French banks, British investors, and domestic lenders all poured rubles into the Tsar's coffers. But every coin was promised back with interest. Victory on the battlefield required victory in the bond markets, and Russia was losing both. The consequences became clear almost immediately. Inflation spiraled as the government printed money to cover what borrowing could not. Prices for basic goods rose fourfold in just 3 years. Bread, which had always been the foundation of the Russian diet, became scarce. Long lines formed in Petrograd and Moscow, with families waiting for hours in the bitter cold for a single loaf. Soldiers at the front wrote home that their wives and children were starving, while they themselves lacked boots and ammunition. The empire, vast and resource-rich, could not feed or equip its own people, because its finances were consumed by interest payments and the desperate costs of war. The situation was worsened by corruption and inefficiency. Railway networks clogged with delays, and supplies rotted before they reached the trenches. Farmers who once sent grain to the cities withheld their harvests, knowing that the money they received would buy less with each passing week. Trust collapsed between producers, consumers, and the state. By 1916, entire provinces simmered with resentment, not only at hunger, but at the belief that the monarchy had lost control. The debt crisis eroded loyalty in ways no enemy could. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers, unwilling to die for a regime that could not clothe them or care for their families. Workers in factories went on strike, demanding both bread and peace. Even nobles and officers, once pillars of the dynasty, began to doubt that Nicholas could hold the empire together. The monarchy's legitimacy, already fragile, was eaten away by the knowledge that the Tsar ruled an empire whose future was already mortgaged. For Americans today, the story feels eerily relevant. When debt grows faster than income, when obligations consume more than what is earned, stability falters. Families experience this when their paychecks vanish into interest payments before rent and food are covered. Nations experience it when tax revenues are devoured by debt service, leaving little for the needs of their people. Russia's monarchy discovered this truth too late. It entered a war on borrowed money and discovered that no throne, however ancient, can survive when its debts outweigh its trust. The empire that had stood for 300 years under the Romanovs collapsed, not only because of revolutionaries in the streets, but because of the unpaid bills in its treasury. By 1917, the crown was bankrupt in every sense, politically and morally. For the ordinary people of Russia, the years of the First World War were not a tale of glory or sacrifice for the motherland, but of hunger, despair, and betrayal. Villages that had survived centuries of hardship found themselves emptying as young men were drafted into the Tsar's armies. Families left behind struggled to plant and harvest, their labor drained away. At the same time, inflation devoured the value of what little money they earned. A loaf of black bread, once cheap and plentiful, became a rare luxury. Housewives in Petrograd queued for hours in the snow, clutching ration cards, only to be told that supplies had run out. Children cried from hunger, while the Tsar's officials insisted that the empire still possessed vast resources. The war consumed everything. Trains that might have carried grain to the cities were instead requisitioned for the front, where they often sat immobilized by mismanagement and corruption. In some regions, food rotted in storage, while urban families starved. Letters from the period describe soldiers begging their wives not to send them news of the children's suffering, because it broke their will to fight. Desertion became common. Hungry, ragged men simply laid down their rifles and walked home, unwilling to die for a crown that had left their families destitute. Factories in the cities became pressure cookers of discontent. With millions of men gone to war, women and children filled the workshops, laboring long hours for wages that bought less each week. Strikes erupted in 1915 and 1916, demanding bread as much as political change. Demonstrators shouted that the monarchy had money for bullets, but not for food. Police tried to disperse the crowds, but the numbers swelled until even soldiers ordered to suppress them refused to fire. In February 1917, when women marched in Petrograd for bread, their protest ignited the revolution that toppled 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The gap between rulers and ruled had never been wider. Nicholas II continued to speak of duty and sacrifice, but he lived in palaces far removed from the hunger in the streets. His ministers promised reforms, but each decree sounded hollow when shops were empty. Even nobles, who had once upheld the dynasty, grumbled at the Tsar's incompetence. They saw their estates struggling under shortages and their influence waning as creditors and chaos dictated the empire's future. Trust in the monarchy collapsed, not in a sudden burst, but in a steady erosion that hunger accelerated. For Americans today, the echoes are chilling. When wages fail to keep pace with rising prices, when shelves are bare or rent consumes a paycheck, confidence in institutions begins to falter. Families know the despair of seeing income vanish before needs are met. Nations know it too. When resources seem plentiful, yet are squandered by inefficiency and mismanagement. Russia's tragedy shows how quickly the gap between promise and reality can destroy faith in leadership. The revolution of 1917 did not begin with manifestos or party slogans. It began with hunger, bread lines, empty purses, and the hopelessness of watching children starve proved more powerful than royal decrees or patriotic speeches. Once people believed the monarchy could no longer provide the most basic security, its fall became inevitable. The Romanovs had ruled for 300 years. Yet in the end, they lost their throne not only to revolutionaries, but to debts and shortages that undermined their bond with the people. When citizens conclude that their sacrifices serve only to pay interest on wars and loans, loyalty evaporates. And when loyalty evaporates, no dynasty can survive. The Russian Empire entered the 20th century, already carrying heavy obligations. But the First World War transformed its finances into a trap from which it could not escape. From the very beginning, the war effort relied on foreign borrowing. France, eager to keep Russia as an ally against Germany, extended vast loans. British investors too purchased Russian bonds, convinced that the Tsar's empire was too large to fail. By 1917, nearly half of all Russia's wartime expenses had been covered by foreign credit. On paper, this looked like strength. In reality, it meant that the empire's survival depended less on its own resources and more on the goodwill of bankers in Paris and London. This dependence carried consequences. Russian officials knew that angering their creditors would cut off the flow of money, so policy was shaped as much by finance as by strategy. The Tsar's ministers reassured foreign investors constantly, promising reforms they had no real ability to deliver. When protests erupted at home over food shortages and inflation, the government hesitated to divert resources from debt payments. The paradox was striking. An empire with endless fields of wheat and enormous reserves of natural wealth could not feed its own citizens because too much of its money was already pledged abroad. Domestically, the strain was obvious. The government printed money to cover shortfalls, fueling inflation that destroyed confidence in the ruble. A worker in Petrograd might earn more rubles each month, but those rubles bought less bread, less coal, and less clothing. Farmers, suspicious of the collapsing currency, hoarded grain rather than selling it for money that lost value by the day. This worsened shortages in the cities and deepened resentment toward the monarchy. The government's pledge to honor foreign debts seemed to come at the direct expense of its own people. The resentment was not limited to workers and peasants. Even members of the nobility and officer corps began to question the wisdom of borrowing so heavily from abroad. They saw how dependent Russia had become on French and British financiers, how national sovereignty itself seemed compromised. In Duma debates, critics accused the monarchy of selling Russia's future for temporary survival. The empire, they warned, was being mortgaged to foreign banks while its citizens starved. For Americans today, the parallel is familiar. Nations that borrow heavily from abroad may appear stable in the short term, but the weight of those debts narrows their freedom. Decisions are shaped not only by domestic needs, but by the demands of creditors. Families understand this feeling as well. When debt piles up, choices shrink. Instead of investing in a better future, households focus on meeting minimum payments, living day to day with little room for change. Russia, on the scale of an empire, experienced the same suffocation. The tragedy is that Russia's enormous potentialites, fertile fields, vast forests, and growing industries, was never fully realized under the monarchy, because so much energy went to servicing debt and sustaining a war it could not afford. By 1917, the empire was less a sovereign power than a debtor state, propped up by loans it could not repay. When revolution finally broke out, foreign creditors lost not only their investments, but their faith in the monarchy they had sustained. Debt did not alone topple the Romanovs, but it hollowed their rule. It eroded trust, drained resources, and forced policies that deepened suffering at home. When the people rose, they did so not just against a dynasty, but against the crushing weight of obligations that had mortgaged their future. By the winter of 1917, the Russian Empire was crumbling under the combined weight of war, hunger, and debt. The Tsar still sat in his palace, but his government had ceased to function as a coherent authority. The army, once the pride of the monarchy, had become a fractured and exhausted mass of men who no longer believed in the cause they were asked to die for. Desertion spread like wildfire. Entire regiments melted away, their soldiers slipping back to villages where their families waited in despair. Officers wrote in their diaries of men refusing orders, mutinies breaking out, and discipline collapsing. The empire's vast armies, raised at such enormous cost, were dissolving before the eyes of their commanders. The financial collapse fed directly into this military disintegration. The government could no longer reliably pay or supply its troops. Soldiers marched barefoot in the snow, rifles without ammunition slung over their shoulders. Supply trains broke down because the railways were clogged or starved of coal. Inflation meant that even when wages were issued, they could not buy enough to feed a family back home. The army became a mirror of the empire itself, impressive on paper, but hollowed out by obligations it could not meet. In the cities, the situation was equally dire. Factories closed as raw materials dried up, and strikes spread from one district to another. Women led demonstrations for bread, demanding not political theory, but simple survival. Crowds shouted slogans that mixed desperation with rage. Peace, bread, land. Police and soldiers sent to restore order often hesitated, some even joining the protests. The monarchy's authority evaporated, not in one dramatic act, but in countless refusals to obey. Countless moments when people decided that the Tsar no longer had the right to command them. Nicholas II responded with stubbornness. He believed that loyalty and tradition would hold, as they had for his ancestors. But in March 1917, when railway workers struck in Petrograd and the city's garrison refused to fire on the crowds, the illusion of monarchy collapsed. With the capital in open revolt, ministers paralyzed, and the army disintegrating, Nicholas was forced to abdicate. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended in a railway carriage, the Tsar signing away his throne as creditors, soldiers, and citizens alike abandoned him. Debt played its part in every stage of this downfall. It had financed the war, fueled the inflation, and drained the treasury until no institution could function. It forced the monarchy to prioritize payments to foreign creditors, even as its own people starved, eroding trust until there was nothing left to sustain loyalty. When the final moment came, the monarchy had no money, no army, and no credibility. It collapsed not only because of revolutionaries in the streets, but because its debts had eaten away the pillars that once supported it. For Americans today, the echoes of this collapse are not distant. An economy can appear vast and powerful, but when obligations outpace resources, weakness is exposed. A government that prioritizes creditors over citizens risks losing both. Households know this in their bones. When bills consume income and food grows scarce, loyalty to the system begins to falter. Russia in 1917 shows how quickly legitimacy can vanish when debts devour trust. The abdication of Nicholas II marked not only the end of a dynasty, but the failure of a financial system that could no longer sustain an empire. What followed was chaos, revolution, and eventually civil war. But the roots of that chaos lay as much in unpaid bills as in radical manifestos. The Tsar's final debt was not one that could be repaid in coin. It was the debt of trust, squandered until nothing remained. The story of the Romanovs' fall is often remembered through images of revolution, the storming of palaces, and the rise of new ideologies. Yet behind the drama lies a quieter, more relentless force: debt. For 3 centuries the Tsars had ruled through autocracy, tradition, and sheer scale. But by the early 20th century, their empire was sustained less by strength than by borrowed money. The First World War exposed this fragility. The monarchy mortgaged its future to foreign creditors, printed paper rubles that lost value with every month, and left its people hungry and resentful. When trust finally snapped in 1917, the dynasty collapsed with stunning speed. The tragedy of Russia was that its potential was vast. Its lands could have fed Europe, its industries were beginning to grow, and its people carried resilience, born of centuries of hardship. But potential alone cannot balance ledgers. Debt consumed resources that might have built railroads, schools, and stability. Instead of opportunity, the people received inflation, scarcity, and despair. Bread lines grew longer, wages shrank in real value, and the empire's leaders seemed unable or unwilling to recognize the abyss opening beneath them. The crown that had once claimed divine right became nothing more than a debtor's office, and the people lost faith in it entirely. The end came not in a single battle, but in the steady erosion of loyalty. Soldiers deserted because their families starved. Workers struck because their wages meant nothing, and peasants withheld grain because the ruble had lost its worth. Nicholas II abdicated not because revolutionaries outnumbered him, but because his throne rested on pillars already hollowed out by unpaid debts. Once those pillars collapsed, the monarchy had nothing left to stand on. For Americans today, the echoes of this story are unsettling. A nation may appear strong abroad, but when its debts grow faster than its income, when its people feel neglected in favor of creditors, legitimacy weakens. Families know the same truth. When bills consume paychecks, dreams are postponed, and hope erodes. Debt is not only a financial burden, it is a social one, a weight that can fracture the bond between rulers and ruled, parents and children, citizens and state. The Romanovs remind us that thrones can fall not just to enemies or ideologies, but to obligations left unpaid. An empire that spanned 11 time zones ended in exile and execution because it could no longer honor its promises to its people or its creditors. Its final debt was not in gold or rubles, but in trust, squandered until it was gone. As we close this chapter, let us take the lesson quietly with us. Power built on debt cannot endure forever. Nations and families alike must ask whether their future is being mortgaged for the present. Russia's fate shows what happens when the answer comes too late. And if you are still awake, listening as the echoes of Petrograd fade into silence, leave a number 1 in the comments so we know you are here with us. History whispers, not in sudden shouts, but in steady echoes. And tonight those echoes come from 5 empires, whose thrones cracked under the weight of obligations they could not bear. Spain, once dazzled by silver from the New World, found its treasure already promised to creditors before it touched Iberian soil. France, brilliant with palaces and culture, discovered that bread riots and unpaid bills could cut deeper than any guillotine. Britain, triumphant at Waterloo, marched into the 19th century as master of the seas, yet bound for generations to a debt so vast that its people bore its cost in hunger and unrest. The Habsburgs clung to their dynasty through centuries, only to see it eroded piece by financial dependency and the revolutions that dependency fueled. And Russia, vast as the continent itself, staggered into the First World War on borrowed money, only to collapse into revolution when hunger, inflation, and debt hollowed its throne to dust. Across centuries and across continents, the pattern is unmistakable. Debt is not only numbers in a ledger, it is a weight that falls on soldiers waiting for wages that never come. on families staring at bread they cannot afford, on nations that pledge tomorrow's resources to survive today. A crown may glitter with gold, but if its promises are mortgaged to creditors, the glitter is only a mask. Every empire in our story thought itself too strong to fall. Every empire discovered that obligations unpaid can undo what armies and enemies cannot. For Americans listening tonight, these echoes sound closer than we might like. In our own time, headlines speak of growth and prosperity, yet families feel a different reality at the grocery store and the gas pump. Paychecks arrive, but vanish into rent, loans, and credit card balances. Inflation quietly steals purchasing power, while interest payments grow. At the national level, trillions in debt mount higher each year, and ever larger portions of the budget go not to schools, bridges, or healthcare, but to servicing obligations already owed. Like Spain, like France, like Britain, like Austria, like Russia, we risk mistaking appearances of power for the substance of stability. And yet history does not exist only to warn. It also exists to remind us of resilience. Spain's decline opened the way for other nations to rise. France's revolution, though born of hunger, carried ideals that reshaped the modern world. Britain's struggle with debt forced it toward reforms that broadened representation. The Habsburg collapse gave birth to new nations with voices of their own. Russia's fall, though bloody and chaotic, showed the raw power of people who demanded that promises broken for too long would no longer be tolerated. Out of debt and failure, new beginnings emerged. For us today, the lesson is not despair, but vigilance. Debt need not destroy, if it is managed with honesty, if leaders place the well-being of their people above the demands of creditors, if societies invest in futures rather than mortgaging them away. Families know this truth at their kitchen tables. A budget built on hope, but not on numbers, eventually falters. A family that chooses to live within its means, to balance sacrifice with stability, builds strength that endures. Nations are different. So as we close this long journey through history, let us pause on the threshold of our own time. The thrones of Europe remind us that power without balance crumbles, that wealth without restraint evaporates, and that trust, once lost, is the hardest debt to repay. America, in 2025, stands strong, but strength is never eternal if it rests on borrowed promises. We can choose to listen to the whispers of history and to learn from them, or we can ignore them and repeat the same mistakes. If you have stayed with me through these stories, if you are still awake as we drift toward rest, I ask one small thing. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story, for there are always more echoes waiting to be heard. Leave a like if this journey kept you company tonight, and share your thoughts in the comments so that we may continue learning together. And if you are still here, still awake, perhaps leave a simple one in the comments to remind us that the past has companions in the present. Thank you for listening, for allowing history to walk quietly beside you tonight. May its lessons give you not only warnings, but hope that no weight is too heavy if we carry it with awareness, that no debt is permanent if we face it with honesty, and that even in decline, the seeds of renewal are always present. Sleep well, and may tomorrow's burdens be lighter than today's.